My name's Greg Pickett, and I'm the Associate Dean and the Director for our MBA program in Greenville 1. I can't tell you how exciting it is to have real bodies back at Greenville 1. So congratulations to all of you that are attending our residency weekend in person. We have about a 50-50 split, it seems, for this residency weekend, but I'm so excited to have the opportunity to host our concentrations again. And I'm hopeful that next semester we'll find more and more ways to connect in person. So let me just say a couple of things and share with you some great news related to our program. Johannes, welcome. I'm going to let Dr. Klein do the formal introductions, but I'm so excited. This is the final presentation for our Innovative Leader Speaker Series, and it couldn't be, I think, a more exciting topic on innovation. So I look forward to your comments in just a second. I wanted to share with all of you some ranking news for the program. In the last year, the MBA program here at Clemson has found several national rankings of note. We have made one of the top programs in Poets and Quants annual rankings, which is a very prestigious ranking agency. We were ranked the 12th most valuable online MBA program this year. And our online MBA program is only 18 months old. So I can't tell you how excited I am about that. And the ranking that relates most directly to what we're going to talk about today is a new ranking that will be coming out this month in the Princeton Review, where our MBA in entrepreneurship and innovation was ranked as the 30th best program in the United States. That's good. And so for all of you that are here getting your education delivered by world quality, world-class faculty, congratulations. And I hope that you're proud that we're getting the accolades that I know will drive the value of your degree. So having said that and bragged a little bit about our program, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Klein for the formal introductions. Matt?
Thank you, Dr. Pickett, and exciting news for the program. And even more exciting is our speaker today for the Innovative Leadership Series, Johannes Mutzke. Johannes is a partner at BlueInc Strategies, a consulting firm focused on helping companies achieve next level growth through customer-centric innovation and strategic scaling. Prior to BlueInc Strategies, Johannes was Chief of Staff for Michelin's Global New Venture Incubator and Customer Innovation Lab. Johannes also serves as an executive coach for the Stanford University D School and has an economics and business administration degree from Vienna University and an international MBA from the University of South Carolina, but we're not going to hold it and make fun of it. So with that being said, please welcome Johannes. I'm super excited to hear him share with you today because I've been a part of seeing that transition he's made in his career to BlueInc, and what he's done is absolutely incredible. So Johannes, take it from there. Thank you, sir.
And let me just ask all of you, if you have questions, Johannes has asked us to just put those questions in the chat and he'll address them as he has time during the presentation.
All right. Can you hear me? If you can you put your thumbs up? All right. Excellent. So I want to do something with you, the ones that I can see, the ones that I cannot see before I go into presentation mode. If you would all please look at me where I am. I'm going to back up and put your arms, look at the camera, straight up in the air. Please put your arms straight up in the air. All right, I'm just going to look across a couple of cameras here, straight up in the air. Straight up in the air, please. Straight up in the air. Straight up in there. Okay, here we go. All right, good. So what I did was I created a little bit of cognitive dissonance there for you. I said straight up in the air, and I was going laterally out. And I was scrolling across, I saw Aaron go like, like this, sort of flapping. Tom eventually went all the way up. So what I did was create that tension between what I was saying and what I was doing. And so that is a huge lesson for us as leaders, that people will pay much more attention to what we do than what we say. I purposely misled you here, but as we go into innovation leadership, that is the task that is on us, to be the ones that are modeling, leading the way through our actions. And we're going to talk about behaviors of innovation in just a minute that are very important. And as leaders, I can't think of a more important thing than to lead by example. So if we're saying straight up in the air, that means this, not this, right? And many times that's where it falls apart, is we say the right things about innovation, we say the right things about leadership, but the actions and the behaviors of our organization and the culture does not support that. And so that's one of the topics, and one of the key topics we want to talk about today. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see presentation. Hopefully that works. Go into presentation mode. All right. Oh, sorry about that. Jumped ahead. There we go. Clemson. Yes, just to are you seeing yourself here on the right, or are you seeing the full screen of my presentation? If you're seeing if you're seeing the pictures, give me a thumbs up. If you're just seeing the presentation, don't give me anything. Okay, so you're seeing the pictures. I'm going to move the thumbnails down here just in case, and then we'll pull back up. Okay. Well, glad to be with you all. A little bit about us, and then we'll jump right in. What we do in terms of BlueInc strategies, we work with companies across the continuum of maturity, but what's interesting is that we found sort of our concentration in two places. We are all about helping companies get to the next level of growth. And what we found is that there's two very interesting populations that are interested in that. And we call them the elephants and the gazelles. The elephants are big companies, large, very successful heritage normally, but that are struggling to find out or figure out how to grow again. They're growing at 2, 3, 4, 5% a year and are saying, how do we innovate and meet the needs of our customers? And there it's all about getting back to customer focus and using innovation to do that. The other end of it is the gazelles. So these would be high growth startup companies that are probably 5 to 50 million or so in revenue. And of course, they're coming out of that season of having understood the customer needs and having a product that's working and it's scaling up. And they've had 3 or 4 people that helped start the company. Now they have 40, 50, 60 people. The company's growing like crazy. And the last thing we need is to implement or give them more ideas. Typically, it's typically there about structure, leadership, teams, and how do we make strategic choices that allow us to do what work times maybe 5 or 6 times 1,000, because that's the challenge of scaling. And so the common denominator for both of those is growth. Both want to grow and both are innovating in their own way. It's just the flavor of that for a gazelle versus an elephant are different. So customer focus and scaling are really the common denominator across all of those. How do we reconnect with our customer needs, and how do we either structure ourselves to grow or innovate in a way that we can bring new offers to market? So that's sort of the focus of what we do. What's interesting to me is that many times we find that the elephants are wanting to become more gazelle-ish. If we could only be flexible again, if we could only run that fast again, if we could only make decisions and innovate that fast again. And the gazelles are looking up at the elephant saying, how in the world did you do that? How do you have that kind of a structure? How do you have all this infrastructure that helps you grow? So in a sort of weird way, they cross-pollinate very nicely. One is really learning or trying to learn from the other. Where we focus, so again, growth being the theme, we have 3 sort of focus areas. We do a lot of work with corporates, which we would put mostly in the sort of the elephant bucket in the rediscovering the customer, rapid growth, startups. So there it's about creating direction, structure, and scaling. And then a lot of work with academia as well. We're innovation fellows at Furman. We do work on the coaching staff with D-School. We're doing this interaction with Matt here at Clemson. And really the passion that I have and that we have as BlueInc Strategies on this end is we love to do. We get a lot of accolades for, you guys are actually folks that roll up your sleeves and do it with us, but we love to teach people how to do. Innovation by definition is all about people, and there's something that our passion in helping people to take on those skills, take on those behaviors, and do it themselves. So that's something we're really passionate about, is not just preaching and talking about it, but teaching people how to do it themselves. So hopefully this presentation falls in that kind of a flow as well, of talking about things that you can actually use or that stimulates your thinking wherever you might find yourself on that continuum. We do all kinds of projects, again, very action oriented. We jump in with our clients wherever they are. So we've done everything across the spectrum of automobile industry, pharma, high levels technology with electronics, RFID. We're supporting about 3 to 4 innovation incubator launches right now, one of which is overseas. City incubator, mobility incubator. So a lot of innovation work across the gamut of industries. Here's just a look at our team. So you can see there myself, Sarah Holcomb is joining me today. So she's our chief experience designer. Amazing person, comes with a very rich pedigree, was the chief designer for corporate programs at Stanford University. And before that, worked for Google and was a designer for Google Glass. So a lot of experience there has really taken our whole innovation practice to the next level. And you will hear from her also in a few minutes. So that's for the introduction. I would like you to take a look at this article. And the reason that I love just having scanned it and stuck it in is it is off of a piece of paper that I was mulling over. And just read through the top section there. In our research, we identified 6 innovation paradoxes, and see what you sort of feel there. Challenge for leaders is to help the organization continue to recalibrate, affirming the individual, group, support, confronting, fostering experimentation, performance, promoting improvisation, structure, showing patience, urgency, encouraging bottom-up innovation, intervening top-down. And then it says leaders who stay on the right side of these paradoxes will never unleash the full genius of their people. Few ideas or no ideas. Those who stay on the left will have lots of ideas and options, but won't be able to turn any of them into useful solutions. So you see the paradox, or you feel the tension, right? Individual, group, support, confront, experiment, perform, improvise, structure, patience, urgency, initiative, intervening, and top-down structure. So again, you feel that inherent tension. And I think that is sort of the hallmark of innovation. We like to think of it in terms of a picture. We're all about metaphors, because I think they're very powerful and they explain things really well. On the picture, you see grapes. Those grapes, beautiful, various level of ripeness probably. You see vines that are holding the grapes. But if you look through all of that, the vine, the grapes, you can see a stick or a pole. You can see like a tie down that's used to hold that all together. So there's sort of this organic part that we typically think of that's in the forefront. But then you have sort of the structure that holds it together. Here's sort of a funny picture. I'm from Germany originally. Probably can tell by my name that I was not born in Greenville, South Carolina. And so I was visiting my parents in Germany. This is their backyard. And this is a vine that they have. Now, what you can tell there is it's a disaster, right? It's hanging all over the place. There's some kind of a string tied to the top of the garage. It's sort of collapsed, right? The trellis is missing, right? There's all the vine. There's the growth. You can even see grapes on there if you zoomed in. But the thing holding it together is, that's what a vine looks like that has no trellis. And so we've sort of taken that image forward, and what we talk about a lot when we talk about innovation, it takes the vine and the trellis, or trellis and the vine. The vine being sort of the culture, the behaviors, the mindset behind innovation, the trellis being the structure that you need in order to protect and hold that vine up and give it a chance of growing. And what we find a lot of times is you can go into the ditch on both of those sides. Some people go way on the side of trellis, which is, we just need to create structures and committees and processes and maps and all that kind of thing for innovation. And they never really get sort of the heart and soul of differentiated outcomes or any kind of breakthrough things. The other side, you can go into the vine ditch, which is, it's all about, we're going to be creative, we're going to think differently, we're going to change the world. But there's really nothing behind that to hold that together, and it doesn't really happen. We keep telling people to behave differently or trying things, but they're one-offs and they don't really work. And so what we subscribe to is the fact that you really need the vine and the trellis of innovation, both the culture piece and the programmatic or the framework to hold it up and hold it together. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So as we go forward here, back to the elephant and the gazelle, often we find, you've probably heard the terms of exploitation and exploration. We'll dive into that a little bit more in just a few minutes. But in the exploitation world, it's sort of the incremental approach of taking what we know and continuing to improve upon it. Timelines are typically long. We have a long history of having done things, and we add to that incrementally. The knowns are known. The timelines are long enough. The time horizons have to be split. So we sort of incrementally move down the road towards a destination, assuming that the destination is known. On the exploration side, so this is more in the gazelle territory, we have short timelines. We have to learn by doing, we're experimenting. The front looks very crazy because we're trying to figure out what's going on. There's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty. We experiment as a way to learn. We're de-risking as we go. This is a learning process. And we don't really know the destination because every loop, every turn in the road opens up another piece of road that allows us to see further. So you can see the tension there between, again, sort of that certainty of execution and the knowns and incrementalism versus the exploratory, where should we be, how do we focus? And what we find is that on that path, on that gazelle path of exploration, there are certain mindsets and behaviors that are key. So human-centered or customer-centric, very important, all starts there. Having a process, so having a way of doing it. Radical collaboration, so collaborating, working with others, not in a silo. A culture of prototyping, so doing things, putting things out in front of customers to learn and doing that right from the beginning, not waiting till the end. A bias towards action, towards sharing, towards doing as a way to learn versus thinking. And showing things, we all know that putting things in front of people to see, to experience, to test is the best way to learn versus thinking about it, only conceptually, or putting that only in front of the customer at the very end of the process. So the big thing here, if we think about where to start, and I've put some of these tension points underneath, they may not resonate every one of them with your organization, but that's where we see a lot of the rub with established organizations. Mindful of process, that's where many organizations go into need for prescription enforcement. Culture of prototyping, we can't put out anything that's not perfect. It has to be right the first time. We can't put out something that might be low fidelity. A bias towards action could be a bias towards thinking and analysis before we do anything. Instead of being human-centered, we tend to be maybe more product-centric or data-centric or technology-centric. And so where it all begins for us is typically on this side, on the human-centric, customer-centric side. We talk about empathy being a very important trait of this side of the equation. So understanding behaviors, emotions and feelings, needs and pains, connecting, experiential immersion, those kinds of things that really allow us to connect with the latent needs of our customers. Not only what they're saying, but also what they're doing, how they feel, what is actually underlying the reasons that they act in or behave in a certain way. We love this quote by Brene Brown: empathy is not connecting to an experience, empathy is connecting to the emotions that underpin an experience. And we often find that those experiences come to life the most when we are with the customer in their own story, not in our story, and not with hypothetical questions. So for example, we don't have time for this now, but I would love at some point if I said, open up the group chat, and I want you to tell me how many of you subscribe to a healthy lifestyle. How many of you think that a healthy lifestyle is good? You don't have to do that now. I'm sure you would put something in there. Yes, most people do. But then what if I asked you, so what did you eat this morning for breakfast? That would be an interesting thing for me to see, right? We did this one time at a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and everybody almost unanimously said, we subscribe to a healthy lifestyle. And then I said, what did you eat this morning for breakfast? I think half the group said nothing. They did not eat anything. They didn't say anything, but they didn't eat anything. Another person ate a hamburger. So a disconnect between what we profess or say and what we are actually doing, and not because anyone's lying or has bad intentions, but that's really where understanding the behaviors of people is key. I love this slide because that sort of brings to life often the disconnect when we try to attack a innovation problem only from the discrete and rational side versus understanding the emotional side. Here we have, these are oranges versus I love oranges. Two different things. I think we could all agree those are oranges based on the picture. I love oranges is a different thing. Here's another one, football. I have to talk about football if we're going to talk about Clemson. So on the right-hand side, sort of the discrete and rational part, does it matter the weight, muscle mass, heartbeat? Of course it matters, right? That's part of the thing as well. That's a very important component. But think about the emotional side. Am I motivated? Do I get along with my team? Do I have energy? Do I believe we can win? Do I really want to be here today? Do I have other things going on in my life that are distracting me? I would make the case that those probably have even more impact over your weigh-in weight before the game or over your heartbeat potentially. So again, understanding those things that are beneath the surface, that human centricity of innovation is very key as a key trait for organizations that want to have a breakthrough in that area. There's a key behavior. So how do you do that? It's easy for us to talk about that theoretically, but what I'd like to do is unfold a story for you that brings that into practice. And we have, I think, one of our greatest storytellers ever with us, which is Sarah Holcomb. So Sarah, if you can unmute yourself and we'll jump in with this.
Yes, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, awesome. I'm seeing some comments about breakfast, and I will admit the hamburger was actually me. So that was me, and I see Cocoa Puffs, which is also a very healthy breakfast option. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to tell a really quick story about a close colleague named Doug Dietz. He was a fantastic designer for GE Healthcare, and he actually just retired after 31 years being there, and his last role was principal designer. So he's a fantastic designer and a great illustration of putting the behaviors that Johannes was just talking about into action. So next slide. So this was primarily one of his big projects that he worked on. It's an MRI scanner, and you all might be somewhat familiar with it. It's, a very large multi-million-dollar machine, and he won tons of accolades for this machine. And so he was tremendously proud of his accomplishments, particularly around the design, the technology, how accurately it scanned, and so forth. So one time he went to a hospital right after he had completed a new design, and the machine had just been installed. And he was walking up to talk to the technician, and was asking him, oh, how's the scanning? How do you like the technology? Is it working for you? Just the kind of general questions that he would ask the technicians who he saw as his customer. And they were like, oh yeah, it's great. I love it. Great scans and so forth. So Doug was feeling super proud. And then all of a sudden he turns around and down the hallway comes a family who had a little girl in tow. And he started to notice something really outstanding that he wasn't expecting to see at all. And so the technician saw them coming and asked Doug to kindly stand outside because they were going to be coming in for a scan. And so the little girl, as she's walking down the hall, started breaking down, was starting to cry. The parents were obviously nervous, very worried about their daughter. And so the technician, Doug was sort of seeing this all unravel in front of his face, called for an anesthesiologist to come on over because more than likely she would need to be sedated. And so Doug asked the technician, well, how many times do children need to be sedated? And he said, well, it's unfortunate, but oftentimes it's about 80% of the time. And so next slide. So Doug left that scenario and was like, wow, I had never really considered, you know, my end customer, who are oftentimes these little children who are going in to get a scan. And so he went back to the people he worked with and was like, I really need to tackle this new challenge, but I don't know where to start. And so they said, well, we've heard about this fantastic program at Stanford University. As you know, I worked there. And so he actually came to one of our programs at Stanford for customer-focused innovation. And there he really learned the tools of empathy and the various different methods of design thinking. So after he completed the course, he went back and he was super excited to dive in. And one of the first things he did was to do some empathy work with children. And so here you see him and some colleagues, and he brought in a lot of radical collaborators. For instance, he had someone from a local children's museum come in to work with them to really see how these children see their lives. Next slide. They also decided, well, we should really go to their homes. And so they saw a couple things. Next slide. They heard things like, well, my brother gets to go to camp, but I can't go. And they also observed things like there were no trophies in the rooms of these children, unlike their siblings. So they had to do a leap, which we call an inference. They made an inference and they said, I wonder if this means life-threatening illnesses suck all the adventure out of her life. And with that, they were able to reframe the challenge and figure out a whole new set of solutions for these children. And this was a complete departure from what he was doing previously. And he knew he would have tight budgets. And so with his volunteers, they brainstormed lots of ideas. And one of the ones that they decided to pull forward was, next slide, what they called the Adventure series. So this is something that you can research and see a lot of different versions of online. This one, you'll see a jungle adventure. The next one, please. This was a pirate ship. So this was actually one of the first prototypes that they installed at the hospital. And it was a really cool way of creating an experience around the MRI to delight the end customer, the children. And so in this particular scenario, the children would come in and the technician would be playing a role of, say, the matey, and he would encourage the kids to walk the plank towards the pirate ship, but they had to stay really, really still while the scan was happening to get to the pirate ship. And next slide, please. And they also had things like Cozy Camp, where they would get a backpack with their hospital orders. And if they would lie really still, they might see the stars shooting across the sky in this one if they were very, very still. Next slide. And so overall, it was this is a fantastic illustration of stepping back from what you think is a problem space and seeing solutions in lots of different areas that you would never would have realized if you hadn't empathized with your customer. And Doug, I would say, is a great example of someone who puts these into practice and really has absorbed the practice of empathy in particular, and the importance of designing for emotions and the underlying pains that exist around different sorts of problems. All right.
Thank you, Sarah.
Sure.
Sarah joining us actually from San Francisco, so she's a couple of time zones over from us, and we've had the opportunity to work with Doug quite a bit, and so it's a great story here. Couple of things though to just lift out as Sarah did. I loved some of the quotes on there. If you may have missed them, but one of the little children said, "Can we come back tomorrow?" Or one of the moms said, "My daughter asked me if I could go to camp again and if I could go there by myself." Think of that in contrast to 90% sedation. To, I think Sarah, did it go down to, I think, 10% or less?
Oh, yes, I believe it was 10%, which was outstanding. And a couple other things I didn't mention too, the patient satisfaction scores went up to 90%, which is a huge improvement. So there were lots of wins on all different fronts.
Yeah. And think of the beauty of this example too, is I can't think of a lot of industries that are more highly regulated than healthcare. And there's probably 1,000 constraints and 1,000,000 reasons why this can't work and we can't do this. And I can even imagine in the first brainstorm that someone said, they don't have trophies and adventures. Let's take them all to the jungle. And everybody's like, are you crazy? We can't take them to the jungle. These kids are sick. Well, that's an interesting design challenge, right? So how can we take the jungle and bring it in to our scenario, right? And think of the way to get to what they got to by bringing those two things together that you would think initially when we're doing those big radical loops and we're going right, left, center. If somebody has an idea on the jungle, then we want to do a pirate ship. Bringing those things together to actually make it work and bring it into a form that actually works for the customer. So again, the idea here of behaviors being key, and we talk a lot about behaviors being the definition of culture. I love the quote there from CEO of Walmart. You can't overemphasize enough the importance of culture, and what we mean by that is behavior. A lot of times we hear companies talk about culture. Everyone agrees that it's important, but nobody really knows what it is. It's everything and anything. It's like a cloud. You can't put your arms around it, but we think of it in very clear terms. The culture is the behaviors that you see your people doing. And if you want to be a leader in innovation and move the needle on those things, it will take a shift in culture towards these behaviors. So behaviors are really what we're after. Back to our analogy of the vine and the trellis, and I only want to spend a few more minutes here, shifting over to the trellis side. So here's the behaviors. If we take the behaviors as the vine, the mindset as illustrated by GE, and the example that we have there, what's the challenge here on the trellis and how to organize it? We've talked about incremental and discontinuous, or exploration and exploitation. And what we find is that incremental is very much more on the sort of elephant side. Discontinuous typically lives outside. And what we're thinking of is when we have a large organization who wants to be innovative, you sort of have that tension now built in. How do you do that? And why is that a tension? It's because we often find, as I said in the beginning, that companies don't understand the need to manage these things differently. You cannot manage them in the same way. Why is that? On the incremental side or the exploitation side, it's about planning, designing, building. On the discontinuous side, it's more about generation, incubation, and scale. If we use words like exploit and explore, again, to bring those up, those are capabilities that are on both sides. I think it's important to say here that no one is saying here that exploitation, or if we go back one, the incremental approach is bad. Those things are very necessary, important to run a business consistently. If you have a pilot landing a plane, not time for exploration, right? We don't want to do post-it notes. And I wonder if we should land the plane like sideways this time. Nope, follow the protocol. Do it as you've been trained 1,000 times, right? If I'm designing the next plane for 5 or 10 years from now, maybe then I'm exploring and I'm trying to figure out how to do that. But both of those things live in different places or different ways of thinking and have to be managed differently. And I think surprisingly to us, but not surprisingly to people in the real world of doing this every day, it's sometimes difficult to differentiate, and more often we make the mistake that we don't manage those in a different way. If you look at the statistics around percentage of resources dedicated to exploration in typical companies, less than 3%. So no wonder that the culture is tilted much more towards exploitation, and that's the predominant one, is because so little of our organization is actually working on the exploratory side. But that also means that we have to purposely manage that differently. What do we do on the exploratory side? If we zoom in there, it's about generating ideas, incubating ideas, and scaling those up. So how do you organize for success? So a couple of organizational principles I want to leave with you. I think one of the big principles to understand is what we've said already, the tension of managing in an asynchronous world. A lot of people talk about change going from A to B. In fact, change is much more complicated than that, because for a while you have to continue doing A and stretch to B. It's not like we can leave our current business behind and do something else. No, the current business is paying the paychecks, feeding payroll, creating the value for the customer today. We have to continue doing that right, but at the same time stretch forward to a different horizon to do that differently. And that's why those two things have to be held at the same time, but managed differently. I love the quote here by Clayton Christensen: when confronted with a disruptive change, organizations cannot simultaneously explore and exploit, but must spin out the exploratory subunit. So the exploration part has to be done too. Both have to be done, but in a different way. Charles O'Reilly, we've done some work, and he's with Stanford, and he's one of the leading thought leaders here on the subject of how to manage innovation in a larger organization, how to master this asynchronous world. It all starts obviously with a company strategy, but then declining that into what we would call an innovation agenda. What part does innovation play in the realization of your strategy? Right, making very clear, here's part of our strategy that's dedicated to continue maybe doing what we're doing or incrementally expanding or going into other markets. But here's the part that we really need to focus on, where we need innovation to play a role. And often we find that a lot of innovation organizations have never really articulated what their innovation agenda is as it feeds to the strategy. And therefore, the innovation efforts are often looking for purpose. Like, yes, we're supposed to be creative and doing all these amazing things, but how does that tie to the bigger purpose and plans of our company? And so you can see here the different horizons that are articulated. So Horizon 1 is the here and now, maintain and defend the business. Horizon 2 is pushing that further on nurture emerging business. And Horizon 3, creating genuinely new businesses. And you can see even within each of those, there's a seesaw of explore and exploit. There's still a part of that that's exploring new opportunities within those horizons, and then as they get more mature, exploiting and scaling those up. So it's almost like those curves within each one of those curves. An example, again, I love the Doug Dietz example, and I think a lot of this is interesting theoretically, but how does it work practically? Here's Ball. Many of you probably know Ball from canning jars. You've probably seen the glass canning jars with Ball written across across the side, sort of the lettering. At least that's how I've always known them. And if you deep dive into their strategy and what they've been able to do, it's an amazing company. I did not know this, but if you research and you look back far enough, they actually did woodworking. That was their the backbone of their business. They then sort of progressed into glass, about a $3 billion business for them. Obviously the canning jars, that's not the only thing they do, but they developed a real expertise and prowess in glass products, leveraged glass to do work in aerospace, so advanced materials that could be used in aerospace, and have since expanded that again into advanced metals and metallic structures. So here's a company who is, it's an older company. You can see there in the quote, 137 years old, who has launched these new businesses and horizons, one building on the other, but each one held sort of separately and developing a product or understanding their customer needs on those different horizons. And here again, we have sort of the success factors of those horizons, sort of interlocking horizons. And what does it take? So here's a couple of, I would say, key things to think about when you're thinking of how to organize and how to separate these innovation activities or organize them within your company. A couple of best practices here. Obviously, we've mentioned before, having a common vision, strategy, and innovation agenda. Again, we often find that people are working on innovation and they do not understand how they fit to strategy. What are we innovating against? If you think of the fact that a lot of the seeds you put in the ground on innovation don't germinate for probably 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 years, if you're thinking of something at scale, and that would be really fast. Deciding in year 6 that you have the wrong seeds is too late. You have to be confident that the seeds you're putting in the ground are actually feeding your strategy. They can't just be random. Let's just go innovate around something. What direction are we innovating in? And that has to do with strategy and doing the hard work of linking that back to your innovation agenda, back to strategy. Ensuring that you can work differently. So ensuring access here to core assets. That is key as well. So you have assets that the company has, whether that's brand, whether that's know-how. If you think of the previous slide about Ball, you know, the glass know-how on advanced materials and glass is feeding the aerospace. So it would be a mistake to cut off those horizons and say, we have a separate organization, they don't talk to each other. So how do you have a separate organization, but still has access to the core strengths that empower the organization to do what they do today? Things I would say are the big differentiators as we think of organizing ourselves, having that common vision that's linked to an innovation agenda, ensuring access to your core assets and resources. So making sure there's a tunnel back to the assets that make you strong as a company so you can leverage that for innovation, but managing those separately and differently. Remember going back a few minutes when we were talking about exploration and exploitation, and then beyond that back to the behaviors that are so different depending on what part of the organization you're in, if you're on the exploring side or the exploiting side. That's the reason why we have to protect the exploring side so that it can actually run differently. Remember, there's 3% or so that is dedicated to that. So that little piece is very vulnerable. And unless held separately so that we can act separately and we can have these behaviors we talked about and we can have this focus on our innovation agenda, we're going to get swallowed up by the exploitation side and not be able to innovate as we should. So what is our job as leaders? I'm leaving you with this, going back to hold your arms straight up and walk the talk. It's really both of these things, right? Leadership is there to infuse the organization with the right behaviors to get the job done. And today we've talked about innovation behaviors, but I understand that all of you may not be doing innovation. I would say that is a leadership lesson, is your job is to think about how do you advance behaviors that shape your culture. Culture is behavior, so how do you shape those behaviors? And when you're thinking about shaping behaviors, what is the structure you're putting behind it to hold those behaviors and to shape them the way they need to be? Just talking about it is not enough. We've got to do it. And in order to do it, we have to put structures around it that actually support that. So I would love to get into some discussion and hear your questions. I'm going to, the best way, I'm not a Zoom expert, but I think the best way is to stop sharing and go to the chat. Let's find the chat. So if you would put your questions there, Cocoa Puffs is still there, and 6 ounces of salmon. That's cool. All right, so Aaron is asking here, do you have any tips to change the culture of an established company to one of innovation if you aren't in a leadership position? It's a very good question. So I would say there's a couple things here, even if you're not in a leadership position. What we often talk about when we're trying to implement culture change or behavior change in a large organization, and in fact, we worked with a very large organization where we were helping with a staff and innovation council. It's over 100,000 people, and one of their goals is how do we change the culture? Can you imagine changing the culture of over 100,000 people? And so what we determined is the culture is so strong already, and there's a lot of feeling that maybe why do we need to change and what has to change? And so one of the things that was powerful in that organization was what we called putting together or demonstrating a different culture with what we called a lighthouse. So trying to do something differently in a part of your organization. And I would go even further and say the parts of your organization that are best suited for that are what I call the sick patients. The people that have a problem, like the current process is not working. We're not meeting our customers' expectations, or we're falling short, or we're having massive challenges being successful. Those are typically the most, I would say, open to doing things differently. Why don't we try a different approach? Why don't we do a more customer-centric approach, or try something where we harness the ideas of the group to come up with something completely different? So I would say, even if you're not in a leadership position, look in your corner of the world. Is there a sick patient or a sick process that's ripe for another approach because the current one is not working? And that then gives something that you can point to. Look at what we did, or look at how we worked. Maybe there's not an outcome yet, but we're working differently. And that often is something that creates hope in people as well, to say, well, if it can work there, if Eric can do that on this project, or in this part of the organization, why don't you come over here and try that for me? And as we do that, that can often be a huge wind in the sails of change, is just start doing things differently in nooks and crannies of the organization and give people something to point to. Much more effective than just talking about it and preaching. Doing something at a small scale that allows people to see it. We use the phrase a lot of times, do small things and tell big stories. And stories, just like Sarah told you the story of Doug Dietz, are really powerful. Let's go on. Good questions here. Innovation initiatives typically require spending cash up front on research, development. Whoa, they're coming in really fast. Let me scroll up here so I can actually see it. ROI, because of this, does innovation suffer in times of recession when companies are trying to keep their cash? Yes, very, very good question on innovation efforts. Do they suffer when things go into recession? We could do a whole other talk on how to manage and start up a new innovation effort. I'll just say this: when you're starting a new innovation effort, you are always balancing between relevancy and autonomy, right? Autonomy is, I need to be separate enough, like I've just told you, and different enough to work differently. I don't work like the mothership. We have a different process. We work differently. We have to be more innovative. Relevancy is, how close am I to the core business and working maybe on incremental things, or things that maybe are not too innovative but have an immediate payback or an immediate result. One of the biggest traps we find a lot of incubation and incubator efforts falling into is they go straight for autonomy. They've never produced anything, and then all of a sudden want to do moonshots that will not materialize until 5 to 10 years from now. The recession comes, the CEO changes, and the question is, how much money have we spent on this team? And what have we gotten again? Oh, nothing. Looks like a great budget cut for us, right? And so one of the things that we advise people on who are starting a new innovation team is skew towards relevancy, especially at the beginning. Do things that people can see that score quick wins. even if you would say, I have to compromise my mission a little bit, or what I'm really working on is really not that innovative, it's actually sort of helping the core business with their problems, do that first for a couple reasons, not just because you don't want to get your budget cut, but it also creates trust in your capabilities that allows people to invite you into the bigger problems. Wow, you solved this for me. Hey, would you talk to me about the strategy of 4 years from now on that first aerospace deal that we want to get? Right, your capability of innovation and the credibility you have for that has to be earned. It's not given. Again, thinking about a metaphor, I often think of these innovation teams as a small little boat that are chained to a big aircraft carrier. And you can go as fast as you want until you get to the end of the chain, and then you're going the same speed, right? So the question is, how long can you make that chain? And that chain gets longer the more people trust your credibility to be able to produce and deliver differentiated things. So again, counsel to you, Carlos, would be, it's true that innovation can often suffer, and that's often the first thing that goes on the chopping block. But I've seen amazingly resilient innovation teams that have gotten credibility because they've actually made a difference in the short term that allows them and buys them the chain to be working on longer term things. Let's keep going. Let's see. I'm going to scroll down a little further because we have so many good questions. Is there a concrete measure to transition a product or service from exploring to exploiting? So there again, it's one of those things that I would say the most important thing is to have a process for that. And what I mean by a process is not necessarily, a flow chart or something like that, but thinking through, we typically differentiate between the idea stage, the prototyping stage, the proof of concept stage, and sort of the market pilot stage. And as we transition those, each time the idea is becoming a little bit more robust, the business model is activated a little bit more, and we start scaling a little bit more. It's like raising a child. You start with a baby, then you have a toddler, then you have, sort of a middle school child, then you have a teenager. They consume more and more resources and food and energy and everything, and that has to be nurtured as we go. What we've often found is that organizations sometimes are ill prepared to know how to accommodate that funnel, right? This thing is starting to get traction, and who do we hand it off to? Who do we give it to? And all of a sudden you have the idea guys who were there for the creativity part trying to run a business, which they're not equipped to do. So thinking through that as we go, again, I would differentiate along those milestones, and we'd have to have a longer conversation, but there are clear criteria for, what constitutes a proof of concept versus what is a market pilot. And at each one of those gateways, I would say, is a reevaluation of who should be running it and what resources do we have to put around it so that it can be successful, so that we don't starve the engine right as it's lifting off. Sarah, I think you have some insight there also on spending in early stages and later stages in correlation with prototypes. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, just to the earlier question, someone was asking, like, what do you do when there's budget constraints? And in terms of early innovation, so when you have a concept that you're testing and not necessarily in the market pilot stage, it's important to keep the resolution and the spending at a minimum. And so that will increase, to your point about the resources that you're spending as you kind of define and make sure that you're getting product market fit. So for early stage innovation, I would say the best bet, especially considering budget constraints, is to keep it at a minimum. And you can do that pretty easily with lots of like paper prototyping, calling up friends to do testing and so forth. So there's lots of ways to be creative about approaching, the early stage innovation process.
There's another question, Sarah, about how do you deal with resistance to innovation when talking to end users? And I think they're specifically talking about technology resistance by end users.
Okay.
You've just had a couple of really good projects around that. Maybe you can speak to that.
And Johannes and Sarah, this is Matt. Thank you guys. I know, just so you know, we're getting close to the 1 o'clock time. So if you can
Sure.
carve off 1 or 2 questions, we'll save the others and I'll go through those.
Okay.
Because I know some of the sections have to get to their 1
Oh,
o'clock.
perfect. Okay. We can wind it down now, Matt, if you would like.
Yeah, I know if there's any one of these final questions you might want to address, or because we still have 4 minutes or so.
Yeah. Sarah,
Or
why don't you go?
closing thoughts between you and Sarah?
Yeah. Why don't you, Sarah, go with the one on resistance by end users to technology?
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure exactly what they're thinking in terms of resistance, but at least as my experience goes, I would say if you're testing an early stage idea, you should not be in love with it and you should welcome that sort of feedback because that helps inform what you do next. And so if you get negative feedback, that's a great thing and that should be expected. And also realize that it's an opportunity to learn more about your customer, not necessarily even learn more about the technology.
Great. Some of our best user feedbacks have been users that were extremely dissatisfied with the prototype because we actually learned a lot about them and why and what they would want to have differently. And so triggered some really good ideas that would come from very negative feedback from initial prototypes. But again, you want that negative feedback early versus sitting on your prototype too long and getting it too late. I would say the last thing I'll address, because I think it goes back into sort of the leadership category is, can we share some examples of companies you've worked with that failed to reach the next level and why they failed to do so? So I'm not going to name any concrete companies, but I would say that typically when you go from starting to scaling, if you think about the real early graph we had in there, that is where there is typically a crucial moment. We call it the entrepreneur's dilemma, because it's what has gotten you this far, which is these wild circles of trying everything. And it was, me, Matt, and the dog running the company, and we were doing everything. Now we have 30 or 40 people. If we don't change the way we work and start working towards a strategy and goals and with a process and a leadership team, we won't scale. And that more than anything will cap our growth. So it's failure to see that transition happening or coming. And then often it becomes a leadership issue of is our leadership team, are we as the founders still able to take it into scaling? Or do we need to recognize that it's time to bring other people around us? I recently had a CEO who said to me, I think the company's outgrowing me, telltale sign of the innovation or the entrepreneurship. I said, as long as you recognize that, the company is not outgrowing you yet because you're actually bringing people around you to help you. The most dangerous is when people don't see that they need to do that. They don't change the way they work. They insist on everything doing it themselves. They don't scale a leadership team around them or have processes to support them. And what typically happens is now they have sort of bottlenecked their own growth, and it becomes, they become captive to only the magnitude of the business that they can manage. And that's when we never get into the next level growth, is because we haven't changed the way that we work to support scale. And with that, I think we are at 12:59. So
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let's give everybody a little round of applause.